What if Russia is secretly opening a new strategic route to keep Iran supplied, while directly challenging the West at the same time? According to multiple reports relayed by the New York Times, Moscow has reportedly intensified shipments of missile related components to Iran through the Caspian Sea, a discreet route. Poorly monitored, and, most importantly, almost impossible to block. While the world remains focused on the Strait of Hormuz, another corridor may already be becoming the logistical heart of an explosive alliance between Moscow and Tehran. And what is unfolding here could completely reshape the balance of power in the Middle East. For several weeks now, one detail has been increasingly alarming Western intelligence services. Maritime traffic between Russia and Iran across the Caspian Sea has been rising at an unusual pace. From the outside, it looks like ordinary commercial trade. Cargo ships crossing a little publicized sea, far from the world's major shipping lanes. But behind that appearance of normality, several sources claim that sensitive cargo may be moving discreetly between the two countries. And that is exactly what worries analysts. According to reports relayed by the New York Times, Moscow may be using this route to send Iran missile-related components and other strategic military equipment. So why use the Caspian Sea? Because this area is almost perfect for discrete exchanges. The Caspian Sea is a massive enclosed body of water surrounded mainly by Russia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan. Unlike the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, or the Mediterranean, there is almost no permanent Western military presence in the region. No major American fleets. Very limited international surveillance. Very few interception capabilities. In other words, if Moscow and Tehran want to move sensitive equipment away from Western eyes, the Caspian becomes an ideal strategic highway. And it is no coincidence that this route is suddenly becoming so important now. Because both countries share the same problem. They are living under heavy sanctions and are searching for ways to bypass Western isolation. Since the war in Ukraine began, Russia has had to reorganize much of its logistical and commercial network. Iran has faced the same reality for years under economic restrictions. As a result, Moscow and Tehran are accelerating the creation of parallel networks outside American control. And the Caspian Sea is becoming the heart of that strategy. In fact, this rapprochement did not begin yesterday. For years, the two countries have steadily strengthened their military cooperation. But since global tensions escalated, this alliance has entered a completely different dimension. Today, this is no longer just diplomacy or trade. It is becoming a strategic survival partnership. Iran provides Russia with certain industrial capabilities, especially in drone technology. Russia, meanwhile, possesses advanced military technologies, strategic components, and decades of industrial expertise in weapons manufacturing. The interests of both countries are converging more and more, and this maritime corridor could become the backbone of that cooperation. What is even more striking is the timing. These movements are happening while tensions are exploding around the Strait of Hormuz, the Persian Gulf, and the broader Middle East. In other words, while the world focuses on traditional flashpoints, Russia and Iran may already be preparing alternative routes capable of functioning even during a major escalation. And that is where this story becomes extremely sensitive. Because in reality, this Caspian route is not just about transporting equipment. It could also be preparing a new geopolitical balance in which Moscow and Tehran become increasingly capable of escaping Western maritime control. And if this strategy works, other sanctioned countries may try to follow the same model. Behind this discrete cooperation with Russia lies a strategic emergency for Tehran. Iran is trying to rapidly rebuild its military stockpiles. And to understand why, we need to look at what has been happening around the country in recent months. The Middle East has entered a phase of permanent tension. Between indirect clashes with Israel, threats of targeted strikes, American pressure in the Gulf, and the risk of regional escalation, Iranian leaders know they must prepare for a far more dangerous scenario. Because today, Iran is no longer thinking only in terms of deterrence. The regime is preparing for the possibility of a prolonged conflict. And in that kind of situation, one thing becomes essential: stockpiles, missile stockpiles, drone stockpiles, electronic components, sensitive military parts. The problem for Tehran is that years of Western sanctions have made access to certain strategic technologies extremely difficult. Even countries with strong industrial capabilities still depend on specific components. Microelectronics, guidance systems, advanced materials, and precision equipment. And this is exactly where Russia becomes critical. Moscow still possesses a massive military industrial base inherited from the Soviet era. Despite sanctions, Russia retains significant technological capabilities in several strategic sectors. For Iran, this partnership represents a major opportunity to accelerate the rebuilding of its military capabilities, to secure supply chains, and most importantly, to reduce its vulnerability in case of regional confrontation. But this cooperation goes far beyond a simple exchange of equipment. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, relations between Moscow and Tehran have transformed deeply. At first, many observers described it as a tactical rapprochement. Today, some analysts speak of genuine strategic interdependence. Why? Because both countries now share powerful common interests. Russia wants to bypass Western isolation. Iran wants to break free from the sanctions trap. And both regimes see the United States as their primary geopolitical adversary. As a result, military, technological, and logistical cooperation continues to expand. Iran is believed to have supplied Russia with drones and industrial know-how used in the Ukrainian conflict. In return, Moscow may be offering far more advanced technological support in sensitive military sectors. This is a survival exchange between two heavily pressured powers, and the more international tensions rise, the more important this alliance becomes. Because from Tehran's perspective, time is working against them. Iranian leaders are closely watching American military movements, Israeli military exercises, rising tensions around Hormuz, and the strengthening alliances in the Gulf. Tehran knows that if a major escalation occurs, its military capabilities will immediately be tested. So the objective is simple: rebuild quickly, produce more, and secure supply routes before a larger crisis erupts. And that is exactly why the Caspian corridor has become so strategic. Because in the event of a blockade, regional war, or increased surveillance of traditional maritime routes, this discrete pathway could allow Iran to continue receiving essential equipment. In other words, Moscow and Tehran may not simply be trading. They may already be preparing the logistical foundations for a future regional confrontation. To understand why this story worries major powers so much, we need to talk about a tiny place on the map that is absolutely vital to the global economy: the Strait of Hormuz. Every single day, an enormous portion of the world's oil supply passes through this narrow passage located between Iran and the Gulf monarchies. It is one of the most important energy choke points on the planet. Dozens of oil tankers cross it constantly to supply Europe, Asia, and global markets. If this corridor is disrupted, even for a few days, the consequences could be immediate: a massive surge in oil prices, market panic, energy inflation, and worldwide economic instability. And that is precisely why Hormuz has become a major geopolitical pressure point. For years, Iran has used this area as a strategic lever against the United States and its allies. Tehran's message is simple: if Iran is attacked or economically strangled, global energy stability could also be threatened. In other words, Hormuz has become a geopolitical weapon, and today that threat is being taken far more seriously than before. Why? Because regional tensions are now extremely high. Military incidents are multiplying in the Gulf, shows of force are increasing, and many countries fear that a single spark could trigger a much larger crisis. In this context, Russia and Iran appear to be anticipating a very specific scenario, one in which certain maritime routes become too dangerous, too heavily monitored, or completely blocked. And that is where the Caspian Sea corridor becomes crucial. Because if Hormuz turns into a major confrontation zone, Moscow and Tehran will need alternatives to continue moving equipment, oil, strategic components, and essential resources. The Caspian offers exactly that solution. It is far less exposed to Western naval forces, far less publicized, and much harder to control from the outside. What we are witnessing is essentially a strategy of strategic insulation. Russia and Iran no longer want to depend solely on maritime routes dominated by Western powers. They are trying to build their own corridors, their own logistical networks, their own protected circulation zones. And this strategy could have consequences far beyond the Iranian issue itself. Because if Moscow and Tehran succeed in creating a system capable of resisting sanctions, blockades, and Western pressure, Other countries under tension with Washington may try to replicate the model. We are potentially looking at a geopolitical shift, a world where certain powers gradually create parallel systems to escape the international order dominated by the United States. And what makes the situation even more worrying is the military factor. Because in a region as explosive as the Gulf, every logistical movement is interpreted as a strategic signal. When Russia quietly increases exchanges with Iran, when Iran works to rebuild its military capabilities, and when the Strait of Hormuz remains under constant tension, many analysts are beginning to ask the same question. Are Moscow and Tehran simply preparing to bypass sanctions, or are they already preparing for a much larger confrontation? To understand why Moscow is investing so heavily in this growing partnership with Iran, we need to look at Russia's strategic situation today. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the Kremlin has faced enormous pressure. Massive economic sanctions, Western diplomatic isolation, technological restrictions, and a costly war of attrition. In this context, Russia is pursuing one essential objective: breaking the encirclement. Moscow knows that time plays a central role in its confrontation with the West. The longer sanctions last, the more Russia needs new partners capable of sustaining commercial, technological, and military exchanges. And among those partners, Iran has become one of the most strategic. Why? Because Tehran possesses something very few countries in the world have: decades of experience surviving under sanctions. Iran has developed parallel networks, alternative financial circuits, sanctions evasion trade systems, and an extraordinary ability to adapt to international isolation. For Moscow, that Iranian experience is extremely valuable. But that is only part of the equation. The other crucial factor is geography. Iran occupies a uniquely strategic position between the Middle East, Central Asia, the Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. By strengthening its alliance with Tehran, Russia potentially gains access to new commercial routes capable of bypassing areas dominated by the United States and its allies. And that is exactly what Moscow is seeking today: to rebuild an exchange system less dependent on Western-controlled infrastructure. The Caspian Sea plays a key role here, because this corridor would allow Russia to connect more efficiently to southern logistical networks while reducing the risk of Western interception or pressure. But there is something even more important. For the Kremlin, supporting Iran is not only about economics or military cooperation. It is also a way to redistribute geopolitical pressure onto the United States. And that is central to Russia's strategy. Today, Washington is already dealing with several major fronts simultaneously: the war in Ukraine, tensions with China over Taiwan, strategic competition in the Pacific, and now the risk of escalation in the Middle East. The more crises multiply, the more American resources become stretched. And Moscow understands this perfectly. By strengthening the Russia-Iran axis, the Kremlin indirectly forces the United States to remain heavily engaged in the Gulf, monitor Hormuz, protect regional allies, and maintain a strong military presence in the region. In other words, every additional tension in the Middle East reduces America's ability to focus entirely on a single theater. This is a strategy of geopolitical exhaustion. And this logic extends far beyond the Iranian issue itself. Russia is gradually attempting to build a network of partners capable of collectively resisting Western pressure. Iran, China on certain strategic matters, North Korea in the military sphere, and several countries unwilling to fully align with Washington. What we are seeing is the emergence of an alternative bloc, less structured than NATO, but increasingly coordinated around shared strategic interests. And in that structure, Iran becomes a critical pillar, because Tehran offers Moscow geographical depth, industrial capabilities, a key position in the Gulf, and, above all, a partner willing to openly challenge the Western order. But this strategy also carries enormous risks, because the closer Russia moves toward Iran, the greater the tensions become with the United States, Israel, and several regional powers. And in a region as unstable as the Middle East, one strategic miscalculation could trigger an uncontrollable escalation. That is what makes this situation so dangerous. Because behind these discrete exchanges across the Caspian Sea, what is unfolding is not simply trade. It is a much larger battle over the future global balance of power. What this Russia-Iran story reveals goes far beyond a discrete maritime corridor in the Caspian Sea. In reality, we may be witnessing something much deeper, the gradual emergence of a new global geopolitical order. For decades, the United States and its Western allies dominated the world's major trade routes, international financial systems, and maritime security architecture. The logic was simple: control strategic choke points, control global trade, and therefore maintain enormous economic and political influence over the rest of the world. But today, several powers are openly trying to challenge that system, and Russia and Iran are among the countries attempting to build alternatives. That is the real issue behind this story. The Caspian Sea is not just a practical logistical route, it is becoming a symbol of a world that is slowly fragmenting, a world where certain states no longer want to depend on systems dominated by the West. We already see this happening in several areas: alternative financial networks, trade in local currencies, independent energy corridors, and quieter but increasingly active military alliances. And the more international tensions rise, the faster this fragmentation accelerates, because every crisis pushes major powers to secure their own networks. Russia wants to bypass sanctions, Iran wants to avoid economic suffocation, China seeks to protect its trade routes, and many other countries are closely watching these developments. Why? Because one question is now being asked everywhere: what happens when a country becomes fully dependent on a system controlled by its adversaries? The war in Ukraine acted as a global wake-up call. Many governments realized that in the event of confrontation with the West, they could be cut off from markets, banking systems, and technological networks extremely quickly. As a result, several powers are now preparing resilience strategies. And what Moscow and Tehran are doing today could become a model for other pressured states: building parallel routes, creating regional alliances, developing autonomous economic circuits, reducing dependence on Western infrastructure. This is a slow transformation, but potentially a historic one. And what worries Western analysts is that this dynamic is becoming increasingly visible. For a long time, cooperation between sanctioned countries remained limited and relatively disorganized. Today, we are seeing much more ambitious coordination: military exchanges, technological cooperation, shared logistics, secured corridors, alternative payment systems. In other words, some countries are no longer simply trying to survive under sanctions. They are trying to create an entirely parallel ecosystem. And in this new geopolitical chessboard, the Middle East once again becomes a central battleground. Because this region concentrates everything: oil, maritime routes, military rivalries, American interests, Russian ambitions, and Chinese strategic calculations. The smallest incident can have global consequences. That is why this Caspian Sea story is being watched so closely. Because behind these discrete cargo ships and little publicized routes, we may already be seeing the first signs of a much larger shift. A shift in which the old rules of the international system are starting to be openly challenged. And the real question now is this: are we simply witnessing a new strategic alliance between Moscow and Tehran? Or are we entering an era where rival blocs gradually begin building entirely separate worlds of their own?